there's an absolute truism that nothing exposes us as to when we face a crisis. Nothing exposes you as a father or a mother more than when your child is not well. We're looking at a life of a man that loved his child, that loved his son so much. He was a royal official, but he approached Jesus Christ with an audacious request: save my son. When I think of this man and his life, I cannot but be touched as a father. John introduces this gentleman to us, and he's called a basilikos. The Greek word here does not mean king, because basileos means king. But indeed, what it does mean, either that the man was of royal blood, or that he was very simply in royal service. This man lived in Capernaum. It was a beautiful town, and if you've ever been in that area, you will have a great appreciation for just how beautiful it actually is. He was a trusted official. He may have lived in the most beautiful house overlooking the cliffs of the Sea of Galilee. It's abundantly clear that this man would have had rank and privilege, and that he was also had access to great power. But this man was sick. His boy was sick. His child was running a huge temperature. Here he was as a father watching his child, who's normally a bundle of energy and great strength and laughter, lying like a limp rag doll, burning up under the bed sheets. I would imagine his house was beautiful. Ornate furniture, he would have had access to the finest foods, and probably anything that he would have wanted, he could have, as well as the access to elaborate parties and being among other wealthy people. But you can imagine that when his son fell sick, the first thing he would turn to was to be dismissive and say, "Don't worry, I've got it under control. I will have access to the best surgeons, the best doctors. I've got it under control." I would imagine he would have had professionals and also have access to folk remedies to try and fix his child. But his child showed no improvement. The most precious thing in the world is his son. And watching his son slip away must have been a terrible sight. I would imagine that him and his wife both would have stayed awake night after night, attending to their child, trying to keep this child's temperature under control, and really praying for a miracle. I can envision him looking across the sea, no matter how beautiful it is, but not even appreciating the beauty anymore. Through his puffy eyes and worn-out frame, he would have probably asked the question to himself, what difference in the world does all of this wealth mean to me if I lose my boy? What would this job matter? Or this beautiful home that I have? Or anything that I pride myself in? What does it matter if I lose my son? I would imagine that he probably would have said at one time that I'd gladly exchange all this wealth for the health of my son. But it is one thing that his money could not buy. He couldn't order it from anybody. He couldn't manipulate. He couldn't get the best surgeons flown in. He could not. And I would imagine as a father, he would have thought, what is it like when I don't see my son playing in the yard anymore? Not hearing his laughter, and that everything around me would have been quiet. Maybe even as an official, he had some regrets. He said, maybe I've worked too hard. Maybe I've been away from home too much. Maybe I could have canceled a few things and spent more time with my child to pray with him before he goes to bed. And he watched his son slip away. I would imagine that as a father, he must have been devastated. He probably would have just sat in tears and just cried quietly. And as a man who probably is in control of so many people and had influence, he probably would have hidden his fears and probably would have cried alone. No sooner he got a suggestion that 20 miles from there, Jesus Christ was staying. And I would imagine as a father, he would have said, I'm on my way, and he got on his bicycle, and he was on his way to make sure that he personally would have seen this miracle worker. Finding Jesus, he does the most uncharacteristic thing that men of power never wants to do, and that is beg for the life of his son. And he basically says to Jesus, if you don't come to my child's bedside, he's going to die. Strange enough, Jesus Christ doesn't respond with a compassion that is so characteristic of him. Instead, Jesus identifies something within this man that just tells you that Jesus Christ knew things about mankind that was divine. And he says, unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders, you will never believe. In other words, Jesus Christ understood that no matter if Palestine News or E-News of Carte Blanche would have said about this miracle worker, or even if the people like Jesus' brothers in John chapter 7 would have said, you're a public figure, you need to get out there and get your brand known. Jesus Christ wasn't interested in that. He wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity or becoming famous. That's not what he wanted. He wanted to enhance the kingdom of God. And that's the subscript that he always speaks about. And this man asked Jesus, clutching his robe, say, please come to my house before my child dies. Would imagine his voice would have cracked. And probably tears down his cheeks saying, you've got to come, and you've got to come now. Jesus says, you may go. Your son will live. And there's something that happens that he immediately turns around and goes home. It's quite interesting that he didn't stop and say, hang on a minute, don't you want to just give me your handkerchief or give me some sign of the cross or do some miraculous thing or give me holy water? He turns around and goes immediately. I want to talk to you a little bit this morning about faith. Because this story speaks of faith, especially in this year. We've come through a very difficult year. And then we also find that with Jesus Christ, he's compassionate. The first faith, I want you to look as a man who had a tentative faith. It's a desperate faith. A faith that is born out of great vulnerability, where he realizes that the only way out of this one is to Jesus Christ. Desperation has a way of humbling you and me. And maybe today you're arrogant and you're prideful and you've got all your ducks in a row and you are very connected and you're together and you've got everything sorted. But be very aware that desperation will change that. There will be areas of your life that you will have no control over. But what is beautiful about that is that it breaks down and exposes our foolish pride. Our pride in things that are really and truly of no consequence to eternity. You see, maybe at these clubs with his friends, they would have made a joke about these people that are following Christ, and even had some jokes about this miracle worker. But then desperation enters your own life, his life, and he has to turn to this man. Sometimes I hear people say that I do not live by faith. And I'll tell you, you're a liar. You see, if I tell you there's a city in India called Agra, and there's a building called the Taj Mahal, how it was built and by whom and for what reason, you might say, oh, okay, that's interesting. And more than likely you would go to Google and you'll try to figure it out and say, oh, yeah, okay, here are the pictures. It actually exists. I want to read what C.S. Lewis wrote in a book called A Grief Observed. I have to believe that Jesus was and is God, and I believe it on his authority. 99% of the things you believe are believed on authority. The ordinary person believes in the solar system. He believes in atoms and the circulation of the blood on authority, because the scientist says so. Every historical statement is based on authority. None of us have seen the Norman conquest or the defeat of the Spanish Armada, but we believe it simply because people who did see them have left writings that tell us about them. C.S. Lewis, there's a movie that is coming out now, I believe in January or February, in America called The Most Reluctant Convert. It's about the life of C.S. Lewis and how he examined his faith and eventually became one of the greatest apologists that engages people who denies the existence of faith in Jesus Christ. You see, there was an old story, and it reminded me of this particular story that we are dealing with. And I can see this young man being such a powerful man going to Jesus. He has a tentative faith. There was a lovely story, and I love watching movies on Alaska. But there's a great story about a traveler that was early in the Western days, and he was traveling over a large river. But then he discovered that there was no bridge. But fortunate for him, the river was iced over. Not knowing ice, or he couldn't identify how thick it was, he then realized that he had to cross the river to get to the other side. And so what he did was, on his hands and knees, he crossed the river. He managed to get halfway across the river when he heard a loud noise. And there was another traveler with a wagon load full of coal and 4 horses across the river and across the ice. And that guy was coming there, hitting those things, and he was across the river. He had faith. But you see, there are times when you and I would crawl to Jesus, not knowing whether Jesus could carry the full weight of my concern and the burdens that I'm battling with. But you see, then another traveler comes past similar to you, and they just go across that river, knowing that the river can carry their weight. You see, Jesus Christ is big enough for you and for me. You see, sometimes we cross that river of faith, and our hands and our knees are hurting, and we know we've got to get to the other side, but we know for one thing, that somehow I've got to get to Jesus. Then there's a limiting faith. Jesus said to the royal official, you may go, your son will live. And here what the man then did was, he says he believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went on his way. This man was trusting Jesus up to that point. Up to that point, he says, okay, I'll do what you say and I'll go back home. He had a limited faith. And sometimes that is what you and I go through. Sometimes we are facing an exam. We don't study for it. We don't prepare for it. And then we say, Lord, please help me. I'm going to be writing this exam, and I'm a bit worried about it. And please help me so that I can get through it. And then what I do is I write the exam in a limited faith. I really expect God to step in to my unpreparedness. There's a couple of others that are similar. In fact, there was a wonderful story of a guy that was flying very wealthy businessman. The plane hit some very bad clouds, and suddenly this plane was in trouble. And the story goes that he was so scared out of his wits that he prayed out loud, saying, "Lord, let us land safely and I'll give you half of everything that I own." Well, the plane landed safely, the weather passed, and as he was getting off the plane, a preacher tapped him on the shoulder and said to him, "Brother, I heard you say if you got down safely, you'll give the Lord half of everything you own, and I know that you want to keep that promise." And the businessman said, No. I made a better deal with the Lord. I told him that I'd go ahead and keep all I have for now, but I promise that if I ever got on another plane again, I will give him all of it. And so often that's the case. Once the crisis has passed, the deal changes. Once we think we got what God has given us, we say, "Oh, whew, that was a close call." I want to speak to you about a man called Ted Turner. Many of you know him. He's the founder of CNN, TBS, and TNT. Did you know that this man is an enemy of the Christian community? In fact, 1990, Ted Turner was described Christianity as a religion for losers. 1999, he said the 10 Commandments should be written to eliminate the prohibition against adultery. He also said that people who oppose abortion are bozos. But did you know something else? He wasn't always anti-Christian. In fact, he was raised up going to church and being a follower of Christ. In New York Magazine in 2001, he planned to actually be a missionary. But he turned his back on Christianity after he watched his younger sister die a very painful death when she was a teenager. And he said, "I couldn't understand how someone so innocent should be made or allowed to suffer." This comes from Mark Riley in the Sydney Morning News, August 25, 2001. You see, sometimes we have a limited faith because our faith tells us, or it is limited to the fact that everything will always go well with me or always go well with my children. But that is not always true. That doesn't always work out the way that we want it to be. And because that does not happen, it doesn't stop making God who He is, the good God that He is. It doesn't stop making the world that we live in a fallen world, where our expectations and the demands we make on God are worlds apart. And then we find a full faith. In verse 51, as he was now going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, "Your son lives." Yet he inquired of them the hour when he got better. And they said to him, "Yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him." So the father knew that it was the same hour in which Jesus said to him, "Your son lives." And he himself believed, and his whole household. Brethren, sometimes we despise having limited faith. But you know, sometimes God takes us from where we are to a full faith, to where you and I can say, "Oh my word." That's exactly the time when Jesus said, "Your son will live." He was not just a fan of Jesus. He was a believer. His entire household understood and saw what had happened. He told them, "I spoke to him, this is what he said, that is what happened." You see, brethren, sometimes we need to be patient with each other so that your faith can grow. But you need to stay on point with God and move from being just a fan to a disciple, to one that absolutely trusts God wholeheartedly. You see, today, it's a new year. Many of us are going back to work tomorrow for the first time. And some of us are still on holiday, and all of that is good. But this year, I want to encourage you to draw closer to God. You see, God cares about all things in your life. Your health, your family, your job, your school, your relationships. God wants you and I to commit our lives to Him completely. There's a wonderful story about Charles Blondin. He was the first tightrope walker who walked across the Niagara Falls. The story is that this man was spectacular. In fact, I watched one of his grandchildren going across one of the New York high-rises the other day. It was just a clip on YouTube. But the nice thing is that Harry Colcott said to him one day, and this guy was just amazing. He could flip an egg while he was in the middle of the tightrope. He would fry himself an omelet and all those kind of wonderful things. But then his manager said, I'll go over with you. And he carried him over in a wheelbarrow. You see, here's the key. It's when you and I allow God to carry us completely. So that as that ice that we are so suspicious of being able to carry us, the Jesus Christ becomes that ice. But Jesus says, I can carry you. Come. You see, He wants you and I to fully commit to Him. The truth of the matter is that all of us needs God. In conclusion, Martin Luther King said, faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase. That is what this man did. Lord, my son's dying. He couldn't see the end, but he said it's going to be okay. It reminds me of the words of Jesus that says, come to me, all of you are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It is not true that God is out there to get you. It is not true that God despises you for maybe what you have done. It's not true. God loves you. He loves His creation so much that He reaches out to you and says, you don't need to carry this thing on your own. You see, understand this year that maybe your faith will be one of a tentative faith. Just sort of giving it a feel. And then a half commitment and then full faith. But keep the main thing and the direction absolutely clear in your mind this year. And stay on course. And you will find that the closer you come to Him, the less you become of yourself, and the easier it is for you to have open hands. So that God must take out of your hands what He needs to. Because trust me, He can give back more than what is taken. Why? He's got bigger hands. So this year I pray that as you go into this new year, I pray firstly that if you've had losses, that God would comfort you. That God would be your ever-present strength and undergirding. But more so, that as you face a crisis today, like this father has and many of us as parents have, that you will know what it is to put your full weight on that Jesus Christ that has promised you He would be there for you. Let's stand and sing our final song of encouragement as we close this morning's service.